Hello, hello. I am sitting here on the sofa with two very sleepy doggies, so spoiler alert, there's a chance that Badger's going to start crying in the background for no reason. 'Twas ever thus. But I thought I'd pop on this week to have a chat about The Artist's Way. So I know I sort of mentioned this in a previous episode. It's a book by Julia Cameron that you may or may not be aware of. I sort of started to become aware of it, I think after watching Chris Atomic on YouTube. So we call her boat content. She's kind of gentle watching. She and her partner and cat live on a narrow boat, and she sort of vlogs the experience of that. And it's very sort of chill with like beautiful shots of the English countryside, and Chris's narration is quite funny and sort of self-deprecating in places, which sort of balances out what can sometimes be quite sort of twee kind of content. I don't mean twee necessarily in a bad way, but I think I don't know. I sometimes find the sort of content that's like my slow Scottish living or adorable living on a narrowboat or doing up an 18th century rural cottage or whatever. If the vloggers or bloggers or whatever aren't careful, it can kind of verge too much into a sort of sugary sweet, twee, overly romanticized version of that life. And if I'm honest, I sometimes struggle with this, especially with content that's about Scottish living, because having lived in Scotland for the last sort of 20 years, um, and I've lived in a few different places of Scotland. I've lived in Edinburgh, Aberdeen. I worked for a while in Glasgow, and now I live in Inverness. So I've sort of been in a fair amount of the sort of major cities. I worked in Fife as well, so I didn't live in Fife, but I worked in Fife. Um, I don't know. I kind of feel like I've sort of come across a fairly broad range of Scottish society, um, and it's not all twee romanticized sheep on the road, little country lanes winding through beautiful glens. So I sometimes struggle a little bit with bloggers and vloggers, content creators, shall we say, who make a living from this sort of overly romanticized, almost like touristy view of Scotland. I'm not going to name check anyone because I feel like that's a bit cruel. Like, there are a lot of very popular content creators out there that generate this kind of content, and like, no shade to them, like everybody's got to pay their mortgage or whatever. But I just find it quite irritating because it's often from people who are fairly new to Scotland as well. And I don't think this is a purely Scottish phenomenon. I think this is true of any sort of idealized um, picture of a geographical location. And I think at the moment, in the last maybe like, I don't know, 5, 10 years, there's a bit of a zeitgeist moment about sort of slow living, mindful living, living in harmony with the seasons. And don't get me wrong, I'm very pro all of that. You know me, if you've been listening or watching or reading for a while, I'm all about nature and the outdoors and seasonality and sustainability and all that kind of stuff. But I guess in my heart, I feel like you can practice those ideals regardless of where you live. You don't need to move to a rural tumble down cottage and make it your whole life's work, to live a sort of slow, mindful existence. You can do that in a city centre. You can do that whilst working a 9 to 5 in a regular corporate type job. And I think I sometimes struggle a bit with this idea that like predominantly seems to come from content creators, that like to live any kind of slow mindful existence you need to either a dedicate your entire existence to it, or b make some extreme life change, quit the rat race, move to the countryside, move to the highlands, like whatever. And it's often sort of people who are fairly new to that lifestyle as well. It's people who've like packed in. I literally saw a comment on a YouTube channel recently that was like, their handle was something like, it's not exact because I don't want to name check anyone specifically, but it was something like slow Scottish living or simple Scottish living or something like that. And their whole blurb was like, 5 months ago, we quit the rat race in California to move to Scotland and, follow us on our journey. And on the one hand, I think, that can be very interesting to people. Like, I certainly follow that kind of content. I mean, Chris Atomic is a classic example of someone who lived in London and sort of sold her flat and most of her possessions and now lives on a narrowboat. And, that's very interesting. Um, on the other hand, I kind of struggle with this concept of like Scotland as one enormous amalgam that is all a sort of like, if you imagine taking all the sort of images of like beautiful glens, moody weather, sheep on the road, getting bundled up in tweeds and arons and tartans to go hiking across a moorland kind of thing, and just smooshing them all together into one image of a geographical place. That's sometimes what I feel like people who vlog or blog about that kind of stuff are kind of trading on, and it's not really representative of Scotland. Scotland is a diverse, multicultural, forward-looking, technologically advanced country, and we're not all living in like tumble-down 18th century farmhouses, battling across the moorland and elements to get to our place of work. Um, and we're not all living sort of existences where we like trade eggs with our next door neighbor sort of thing. And don't get me wrong, like my little hobbity heart loves that kind of stuff. Like, I recently traded some rhubarb plants from my garden for some nasturtium seeds from one of my work colleagues, and I love that. But yeah, I just sometimes think this sort of pushback against capitalism, this sort of like, you can fight the man by checking out of your capitalist existence and repairing your clothes and trading eggs and living more mindfully, is on the one hand like amazing, and I'm definitely pro all of that sort of narrative. But on the other hand, I feel like for some content creators, it's just become another income stream, which is, on the one hand, fair enough, people need to pay their rent, and on the other hand, like, just buying into capitalism just in a different way, and in so doing, creating or perpetuating these kind of stereotypes about certain places that I wouldn't go so far as to say are harmful, because obviously, people romanticize Scotland, and that's partly why people travel here from all over the world, right? Like, that's the basis of the tourism industry, I guess. But I just think sometimes it probably does Scotland a bit of a disservice. It's literally like Edinburgh was the capital of the um, Enlightenment, so a lot of scientific and medical advances came from Edinburgh and Glasgow in the 1800s, and I think that sort of stuff kind of gets forgotten about in favour of, yeah, like moorlands and sheep, Highland cows. Um, but anyway, I digress. Just some thoughts that have been percolating recently. But yeah, I first came across The Artist's Way, I'm pretty certain, through Chris Atomic's vlogs, because she was doing it. And I was just intrigued by the way that she described the course. So for those who aren't aware, it's a book called The Artist's Way, published, authored by Julia Cameron, and it was published in, I want to say, the 80s. I'll double check and I'll write it in the show notes. Um, and the idea is it's a way of sort of recovering your creative purpose, um, and your creative spark, I guess. It's um, aimed at people that Julia describes as shadow artists. So people who are interested in being creative, interested in being artists, but for whatever reason are not able to access that in themselves. So they might be supportive of other artists. They might have partners who are artists or creatives, or they might buy art or invest in creative businesses or whatever, but they never actually take the leap to do it themselves because they feel blocked on their creative journey. For whatever reason, they don't feel that they're able to do it, or they're worthy of doing it, or that they have the creative skills or potential. And then the idea of this book is it's sort of a series, it's 12 weeks, and each week there's a series of prompts, and you can do the exercises in as much or as little sort of detail as you would like to. And the idea is along the way you sort of learn more about yourself as a creative person, and it helps you unblock whatever obstacles you're kind of putting in your own way. And so I thought, well, this sounds super interesting because I'm the kind of person who has always pursued a career in science. Like, I was good at science at school, and I like science and I like animals. And so it just kind of made logical sense to go off and I did zoology, and then I did my vet degree. And so I've always been a creative person alongside that, but it's not something that I've ever like taken the time to sort of culture really in myself. I've always considered my creative pursuits to be a hobby, something that's nice to have, but ultimately not essential to my life, and not something through which I would ever expect to make any money or have any kind of career. And I guess more recently, like in the last maybe 5 years or so, I've been thinking more and more about what I would do once, if and when I don't want to be a vet anymore. Because I'm very lucky that I have the kind of job that is, touch wood, relatively recession proof, relatively pandemic proof. So I'm very grateful to have a job that is like a steady paycheck that we can kind of structure our financial lives around. And I really enjoy being a vet, and touch wood, I think I'm good at it. But on the other hand, it is stressful. Dealing with the general public is not always the most enjoyable. And I'm not sure it's a job that I would want to do for the next like 30 years of my working life. I've already done it for 12, coming up 13 years. And I definitely have had periods where I've felt just exhausted and emotionally burned out. Like it's difficult to handle, it's difficult to deal with people's emotions. And obviously in the vet world, often we're dealing with people who are very sad or very angry about what's going on with their pet, and that can be, quite exhausting. So there is part of me that thinks, as I get older, is this something I would want to do right up until retirement age, And in the vet profession, it's not uncommon that as people get older, they sort of drift away from actual clinical practice, because the other aspect of it is quite a physical job. So there can be a lot of lifting and carrying heavy patients. It can be dangerous at times. I mean, it's not as dangerous as large animal vets, who obviously deal with sort of big, dangerous farm animals and horses and things like that. But even in the small animal world, which is what I do, there's the risk of getting bitten, there's risk of getting scratched. And I know scratch doesn't sound that serious, but like cat scratches can carry some quite serious diseases. And I have had a few colleagues who've been hospitalised for like cat bite wounds. I had one colleague who was bitten really badly on the face and needed quite a lot of sort of reconstructive surgery. So there's always that at the back of your mind anytime you deal with any kind of aggressive patient, which is not that uncommon. And then on top of that, there's the sort of emotional burden of it. Like, this is turning into a bit of a pity party, and I don't mean it to be, but vet professionals have something like a 12 times higher rate of suicide than folk in the general population. And that's something that I'm always sort of aware of, that like, especially working night shifts, I kind of have to be quite careful about my kind of mental health, physical health, sort of quite vigilant that I'm like eating well, exercising well, trying to sleep as best I can, that kind of stuff. And I just think in the longer run, I'm not sure how practical that's going to be, for another 30 years of my working life. So I guess I've been sort of thinking about what I would do if I wasn't vetting, and what I could do potentially to kind of, sorry, I'm just a bit distracted because Badge for some reason is just wandering around and bitching for no reason at all. The problem is, if I turf him out the room, he then bitches on the other side of the door and sometimes just batters through the door randomly. Right, go on. So we'll see. I've turfed him out. We'll see what happens. It's because he thinks I'm on the phone, and then he gets excited. I know I've told you this multiple times, so I'm sorry. It's just like a repeat. He's a repeat offender, and I should probably find somewhere else to record this. But yeah, so I guess that's the background of why I became interested in the Artist's Way. Is just that idea of like, what would I do if I wasn't vetting? What could I do that would bring in money, but still be interesting to me, stimulating to me, something I could do in the something I could do in the longer run, that would be, and something that would give me sort of flexibility, because at the moment working night shifts, for all that it's stressful and whatnot, it does give me a fair amount of sort of time off during the week and things like that, which works really well with Andrew's work, because Andrew also works for himself. So yeah, the idea of working for myself in the longer run is quite appealing. But there's kind of part of me that's like, well, who am I to think these thoughts? You know, that sort of imposter syndrome. Like, I have no formal background in anything creative. I have no expertise, or I was about to say skill. I think I'm good at writing, and that's kind of where I'm using the Artist's Way to try and develop my writing. But yeah, I don't have any sort of background like expertise or sort of formal training. So there's that big imposter syndrome part of me that's like, oh, well, this could never be for me, you know? And I guess the Artist's Way just sort of drifted across my radar at like a really opportune time. So I bought the book secondhand on Vinted, and then I found she has a second one specifically about writing. So I got that as well from World of Books, which, if you're not aware of World of Books, it's a great website for sort of shopping secondhand books. And then I started the Artist's Way, and almost instantly was like, oh, good Lord, this is a huge amount of work. And I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, because obviously anything that's worth doing, you know, is going to take time and energy and commitment. But Julia has you, so every week she has you do a weekly check-in, an artist's date, 3 morning pages every day. So you're supposed to, first thing in the morning, before you get up and do anything else, you're supposed to write 3 sort of free form stream of consciousness journal pages. And she's very strict about it has to be 3, and you have to do it every day. And then she gives you a number of sort of writing prompts as well. So it's just a lot of work, you know, and obviously if you're trying to do that around actual work, like paid work, and other life commitments, you know, like we're renovating a house, the dogs need time, you know, I want to spend time with my friends and my family, I need to ring my mum occasionally, you know, all the life admin stuff that you need to do, like laundry and washing up and contacting electricians about that weird buzzing light fitting and all that kind of stuff, you know. I started it, and then within a couple of weeks was like, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep up with this religiously. And then you sort of feel like a bit of a failure, like this thing that you thought was super important to you, you can't make the time to sort of commit to wholeheartedly. And I think because I'm a bit of an all or nothing thinker as well, I was a bit like, well, if I can't do it 100%, then I can't do it at all, sort of thing. And around the time that I was thinking those thoughts, the Substack floated across my feed called Internet People. I'll obviously link all this in the show notes. And Internet People is a podcast and blog about being on the internet, basically, about sort of internet culture and etiquette. And I think the two, I don't know, because I've only listened to a few episodes, but I get the impression the two presenters are probably around the same age I am, like mid to late 30s, because a lot of their sort of references are very sort of millennial. And the way that they talk about being on the internet, it's definitely, you know, someone who's been on the internet for sort of 15 plus years. So I don't think they're Gen Z. But around the time that I came across their Substack, they were talking about doing the Artist's Way, which is kind of what piqued my interest, but in a bare minimum way. So the idea, they were literally talking about the exact thoughts that I've just given voice to, which is that a lot of people start the Artist's Way and then give up because time and commitment. But actually you can get a lot from the Artist's Way by doing a sort of more bare minimum version of it. And so they were talking about they're doing a podcast series where every week they take a chapter at a time. They discuss some of the writing prompts. They discuss whether or not each of them has done an artist date and that kind of thing. And the idea is that you can sort of just listen along, or you can obviously read the chapter and do some of the prompts yourself and then listen to what they've got to say. And I just thought, you know what, that's perfect, because I think doing it alongside another sort of podcast series is a great way to get a bit of extra support in a way, a bit of what's the word, like oh my goodness, what is the word, where you having like an accountability buddy, a bit of accountability, that's the word I'm looking for. And so I thought having that accountability might just keep me on the straight and narrow. But I also just love the idea of doing it in a bare minimum way, you know, doing the best you can and getting as much from it as you feel able to, but kind of giving yourself permission to not do it if you just don't have the time, or the tasks don't, the writing prompts don't sort of speak to you. I'm going to try really hard to do at least 1 or 2 of the writing prompts every week, because I do think if the aim for me is to improve my writing, it makes sense to do the writing prompts. And I've already done 2 of the week 1 ones, but I thought it would probably be better to write them up on the blog, because obviously the whole point is to write them, not to give voice to them. But week 1 is about recovering your sense of safety, and the idea is that sometimes people can feel creatively blocked because they've maybe not been given a safe space either as a child or as an adult to express themselves creatively. You know, maybe people made fun of them or ridiculed them, or just didn't give value to being creative, and thus they never felt encouraged to pursue those interests. And so the writing prompts were quite interesting, I thought. So I tried to pick one that really spoke to me, that I thought, yes, I can definitely write stuff for that, and then one that didn't really speak to me, so one that was a bit more like, oof, that's going to be a bit of a pain, with the idea being that would hopefully kind of stretch my creative muscles. So yeah, I've written up in my journal a sort of draft outline, and then I thought at some point in the next week I'll write them up on the blog. Might be the weekly blog post on a Sunday, but I also thought I don't want this to become like a 100% Artist's Way blog and podcast series over the next 12 weeks, because obviously not everybody listening or reading is going to be that interested, and I do have other things to talk about as well. So I thought on a week where I've maybe not got other things to write up, I'll make it the weekly blog post, and on a week where I've got other stuff to put on the blog, then it might just be a kind of bonus episode. But yeah, just really appreciated listening to internet people talk about it, and talk about doing it in a bare minimum way, and talk about that as a valid way of doing it as well. Because I think, yeah, being a bit of an all or nothing thinker, I think in my mind I'm like, well, if I can't commit myself 100% to it, then there's no point doing it. But actually that's totally not true. You could do 50% of it and you'd still be doing 50% more than if you'd done none of it, you know? So I do think there's value to doing it even in a more bare minimum way. And even just listening to other people talk about doing it makes you think about what you would have written, or your thoughts about a particular prompt or whatever, and even that is valuable. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting stuck into the book in a bit more. I think I only got as far as the end of chapter 2 before I gave up when I was doing it by myself. The journaling is probably the part that I'm finding the hardest, because if I'm honest, I just forget. I'm very pro using Google Calendar task reminders, and I do that for literally everything. I have like multiple task reminders, sometimes every day. And they can be as silly as like buy milk, or as complicated as, well, not complicated, but like I have reminders for like when to give the dogs their wormers, when to take medication, like when to book a dentist appointment, like reminders the night before to set alarms for the next day if it's things that I might forget to do, that kind of stuff. And that works really well for me. But what I found in the past is if I try to use reminders for things that are supposed to be like joyful or things that are supposed to be like self-help. Like I've been trying for years to get into meditation because I know it would be better for my sort of slightly overactive brain. Um, and I just forget the same way with journaling that I just forget. But I found that if I set reminders to meditate, it becomes a little bit of a source of stress, like another thing on my to-do list, you know? So I haven't really quite worked out how best to remind myself to meditate in a way that doesn't then become like a little bit of a stressful chore. And it's kind of the same with journaling. Like, I definitely understand why Julia suggests doing it when you first wake up. But I've already got a morning routine that I feel works quite well for me, and I'm not massively keen to change that. So I've been trying to do journaling more like in coffee shops. Andrew often works from coffee shops because he works for himself. Um, so he might go to a coffee shop like 3 or 4 times a week, and I, in the past, haven't necessarily always joined him unless it happens to work out that I'm in town for some other reason. But I've been trying to make more of an effort recently to like go into town with him, go for a coffee, and then while he's working, I do a bit of journaling, and that works quite well because I think partly why I struggle to make space for journaling when I'm in the house is because it feels like there's always something more productive to be getting on with. There's always a pile of washing up or a pile of laundry or something that needs hoovered or whatever, you know? And so I have this attitude of like, oh, well, I'll just do a quick tidy round, catch up on a few chores, and then I'll sit and journal. And then a few chores, in inverted commas, turns into like an hour of cleaning. And then by that point, it's time to have dinner or whatever. And then the opportunity to journal or to meditate feels like it's gone. So in the past, the most successful sort of um, what's the word like the most successful sort of period of time that I've had to meditate, streak is the word I was looking for. The most successful streak of time I've had to meditate has been when I've done it just before bed, because that's a period where I don't necessarily have like a set bedtime routine. I quite like to read before bed, but sometimes I go to bed too late, to be honest, and I basically just like brush my teeth and go straight to sleep. Um, but one thing I did think was I could start making an effort to maybe get ready for bed, even just like 20 minutes earlier, which doesn't feel like a huge chunk of time. And I think the beauty of just before bed is it's not a period of time I would necessarily be doing anything else. You know, I would be letting the dogs out for their last pee, shutting down the house, and heading upstairs to brush my teeth and whatnot. But I wouldn't necessarily in that period of time be like, oh, I'll just put on a quick load of laundry or I'll just do some washing up. You know, generally in that last sort of half hour to hour before bed, I'm sort of thinking, well, all this stuff can wait till tomorrow. So I did think maybe what I could try is before I get into bed or when I get into bed, doing a little bit of journaling, a little bit of meditation, and then potentially still having a bit of time to read my book. And actually, even as I say that out loud, I'm like, that would be quite a nice wind down for bed as well. Because I think, like many of us, I can be quite bad for getting into bed and then scrolling my phone. And um, my worst habit is probably just before bed deciding, you know what, I really want to start a new knitting project, and I've got this yarn, and I'm going to go down a Ravelry like rabbit hole literally just before bed, like working out what pattern I could make with this yarn. And then I, get all excited about all the different patterns or whatever that I could potentially make, or pricing up yarn for my next knitting project, whatever. And then when I actually put my phone down and try to sleep, I really struggle to switch off because in my head I'm like, oh, I could make this or that, or it sounds completely ridiculous that the excitement of my next knitting project could be something that would keep me awake. But it is sadly true. And that's a classic example of a bit of a bad habit that I definitely need to break myself out of. And I think, yeah, like we all know that screen time just before bed is not good for us, right? And yet we all basically do it. Like my phone charger is beside my bed, mostly because I use my phone as an alarm clock. So I feel like I have to keep it beside my bed so that if I need to set an alarm the next morning, it's right there. But one easy fix to that would be to buy an actual alarm clock. And then I could charge my phone, like even just on the other side of the room. It doesn't need to be beside my bed. Um, but if it was on charge on the other side of my room, I would pop it on charge and then get into bed. And then I'm very unlikely to get up again to get it, you know? And if it was on the other side of the room, I'd be much more likely to then use that time to like read a book or journal or meditate. Um, the other thing I sometimes struggle with is that I use my phone to meditate. So I use the Headspace app and I really like their guided meditations. But again, you kind of need your phone beside you to be able to sort of navigate to the app and click start and whatnot. But I could again set it going, pause it on my headphones, and then get into bed, and I wouldn't necessarily need to get up again to stop it because it just sort of stops by itself, you know. So yeah, I think there's a few things that I could probably move around just before bedtime that would give me the time and space to journal and or meditate. Um, and I think this is partly why this Creative Way book is quite good, because the Artist Way, sorry, book is quite good because it just sort of prompts you to think about those things, you know. And I think sometimes it doesn't need to be a major life overhaul to give you time and space to do a healthy habit. It can just be thinking about a habit that you've already got and building on it, or just, yeah, moving things around slightly in your bedroom so that you're not tempted to scroll your phone, you know. I think, looping back to the beginning of this conversation about content creators that I sometimes find annoying. Sorry to have a little moan. Um, the other content creators that I find quite irritating are the ones that are like, I made these 10 changes and my life is completely transformed, kind of thing. And I think, like, good for you. And I'm glad that that's working out for you. But for those of us who live sort of quote unquote more normal lives, where we're sort of wrapped up in the day to day slog of life admin and childcare and work and elderly parents and all that kind of stuff, like, the idea of making like 10 major life overhauls is just like exhausting before I've even started, you know? It's like if I could make 10 life changes or healthy habit changes or whatever that would massively transform my life, I would have probably done it already, you know? Like most of us are smart people who aren't necessarily sleepwalking through our lives. Don't get me wrong, I think there is a degree of that for most people, but yeah, I think there's a decent amount of people out there who think and self reflect and wonder about how to do things differently to make their lives more comfortable or efficient or whatever. And I sometimes think this sort of like aspirational content in inverted commas, whether it's on Instagram or blogs or whatever, is sometimes creates more harm than good, because it gives you this idea that like if you could only change these things, like your life would be so much better. And actually, for the vast majority of us, we're probably already doing close to the best that we can. So I don't think it's very helpful to then create these like artificial sort of rules and regulations to your life, like, oh well, this person on the internet did XYZ and their life's so much better than mine, therefore I should do those things. And then when you can't do those things, you feel bad about it, and then it's like yet another stick to beat yourself with, sort of thing, you know. So I'm much more a fan of like, this tiny tweak here made my life 1% better. But overall, all of those tiny tweaks and 1% add up over time to something that is significantly better, but it's not something that like totally transformed your life in a week, you know? Like, ultimately, let's be realistic, a lot of these habit changes do take time. They take weeks, months, years. They take a support network to allow you to get up early to go for a run because your partner takes the baby or whatever. Like, these things are not always wholly within our control. And I think this sort of aspirational content that makes it sound like, well, you only have to change these small things to be a completely different person. I'm obviously being a little bit facetious, but I think that kind of content sort of sets you up for failure, and it can just make you feel worse about yourself ultimately. So I am much more a fan of the sort of like, let's do the artist's way at 50% the effort level and just see what happens, you know? And if I get a lot from it, then great. I can always come back to the artist's way in the future and maybe do more the second time. There's a lot of people who do the artist's way multiple times and then sort of rave about how much they get from it each time.
And obviously you change through your lifetime as well, right? So if you do it for the first time at age 20 and then again at age 30 and then again at age 40, you're probably going to be a different person and get different things from it each time. Um, so yeah, that is my little ramble about the Artist's Way. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear if any of you have done the Artist's Way and what your experience was of it. I'll obviously link in the show notes all the people and books and whatnot that I've spoken about. As ever, apologies for Badger bitching. I put him out and I can still hear him crying through the door, but hopefully you can't hear him through the door. And I think in the future, I think part of the problem with recording this podcast is I quite often sort of just grab moments as and when I can, which means the setup for recording is not always the best. And yeah, there can be some background noise. So let me know if that's a bother. I will potentially endeavour to record somewhere where I don't have the dogs in the background next time. Daisy's now looking at me like, I'm not a problem. You're not a problem, baby girl. You're an angel. It's your brother who's the issue. Yeah. Yes, let me know if you've done The Artist's Way and what you got from it. That was Daisy snorting in the background, if you heard that. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I will keep you updated over the next few weeks as to how I get on. All right, speak soon. Bye.